So over the past year, I've been looking at this particular website and I've noticed a couple of problems with it. One of it is that although it's fast and it's speedy, there's a number of internal problems to the website itself. So for example, the actual server itself is pretty old in terms of what it has in terms of its capabilities, old operating system, and it's not very secure. And then the other thing that I also noticed with this particular build was that it's not very efficient in terms of the way that it utilizes backups under the hood and its deployment. So the deployment at the moment is manual. You go in, you do your Docker Compose up, and then it gives you this nice, lovely website, and you have to install the plugins, you have to do all of that stuff depending on what's on the volume, which is never a really good thing, to be honest. It should always be infrastructure as code. And that's one of the things that I've noticed with this particular website, which has been a little bit lacking. And then the other thing as well is just the lack of infrastructure as code, as well as the automations. So the past 7 months, what I've done is that I've broken all these potential problems down and said, well, okay, well, what are the kind of trade-offs? What are the things that we need to do in order to get it to a standard which makes sense to the customer? Now, for me, that wasn't necessarily a problem. And the reason why was because, well, I just needed to break it down. So I thought, okay, well, what are the functional and non-functional requirements of this particular project? So now if I go back to my Miro board over here, these were just some of the things that we talked about, right? It needs to be fast, it needs to support high traffic, the uptime monitoring. So that's another thing that was missing from that particular project on that particular version is the uptime monitoring, because it didn't have any means of saying, well, okay, in the event of an error, how are we supposed to know how to fix it, right? We don't have any means of telemetry of saying, well, what's going on with the website. We don't have any Slack, we don't have any Prometheus, no OpenTelemetry, no distributed tracing, no nothing, no SRE to say, okay, well, what's going on here. So that's another problem that we have to solve. And then the other one, which is the most kind of controversial one, is minimizing the cost. Now, why do I say it's the most controversial thing? Because in large enterprises, right, you have a certain amount of budget which you can use in order to then say, right, this is the architecture that I'm going with because I can support it and I can justify the budget to my manager, to the procurement manager, and say, right, this is the thing that I'm going with and this is the reason why. Now, in my case, I have to go with this is the reason why I'm doing this based upon the budget which I have available. Now, the budget which I have available for this particular project is around £50 to £100 a month. That's it. Everything has to be done in that particular slot. Now that is a bit of an ask, right, for an architecture of this particular size, because this is something that an enterprise could charge £3,000 to £4,000 for easily. I mean, if I was to do this for a client which is more enterprise SME as opposed to more small business, I'd probably be charging this much, to be honest, because at the end of the day, it's a lot of work for me to be doing as a solo developer. Now remember, I'm a solo dev on this project, right? A solo dev, which means I have to look at SRE. I have to look at deployment, CI/CD based deployments, the Terraform. I have to look at the architecture and make a sound judgment as to whether or not the trade-offs justify the cost. So what does that mean? So it means things like, does EC2 make sense here? Does Azure Virtual Machines make sense here? Does using GCP, does using any of these particular technologies make sense for what I'm trying to achieve and build? Now, if they don't, there's no justification for me to turn around and say, this is what I'm thinking, because I don't have a leg to stand on, right? Now, many people that I see online at the moment, they're making all these projects. They're nice, Nginx-based projects like EKS, AKS, all this sort of stuff. But I always come and say, I always have the same thing in the back of my mind. I always have the same thing in the back of my mind, which is, what is the purpose? What is the justification for these particular type of projects? Does it have any sort of cost, monetary cost? How does it save money? How does it benefit somebody else's business or your own, right? Because to go then say, for example, you built a solution within 3 weeks is a great thing. Yeah, I'm not saying no, right? But what was the justification for building that thing within 3 weeks? What benefit was it to you? Was it just a project, or was it something that had monetary gain? In my case, this particular project had monetary gain and a lot at stake for me, right? Not only because it was my family's own business, right, which is a separate thing in itself, But at the end of the day, there was a lot of thinking because this is a production grade system that's going to be client facing. Yeah, it's a client facing server system, which means that there are many trade-offs and many different problems that have to be had here. And I've just explained some of them. Yeah. So what kind of architecture, right? What kind of things could we say to the client to say, right, okay, this makes sense and this doesn't make sense, right? I've already talked about AKS and GCP and all this kind of stuff. Now, why did I turn all this sort of stuff down? Because with GCP, AWS, and Azure, one of the things that you'll notice is that there's a bit more of a capex to it. Now, in the initial phase of this particular project, the first iteration was a solo EC2 T2 micro instance. A T2 micro instance pretty much solely, right, without a load balancer, without an ASG, right, just a single T2 micro instance. Now, you can imagine what happened to that instance. I'm sure a lot of you can imagine it. You know, the cost was fine, it was £20 a month, right, to have this particular T2 micro on all the time. But the problem became justifying it in terms of the volume of traffic that was coming into the T2 instance, T2 micro. What we realized was that as more and more people came, despite it being a WordPress site, more and more people hitting that particular server caused the server to become, basically it was DOSing the server, denial of service to the server. And because of that, what happens there is, well, now we've got to think, okay, well, now we need to have speed, maybe even a bit of redundancy. Now, normally, I would say redundancy makes a lot of sense in this case. Normally. But we've got to bear in mind the cost. So that's one of the trade-offs that I had to think about. Is it best practice to have redundancy? Absolutely. But does it justify the budget that we have? No. No. That puts pressure. That puts pressure on me. Why does it put pressure on me? Because anything could happen to that particular instance. It means that we have to have a lot more heightened monitoring than what we would normally have inside of the enterprise. Because within the enterprise, you'd have something like an ASG. You'd have something like, a redundant model, a load balancer to say, right, okay, I want to move the traffic from one place to another. In my case, I don't have that luxury. I've got to rely solely on CDNs to get that traffic from where I am locally on my VPS directly out to the client. Which means that I have to have monitoring in place and defenses in place for that particular server to be as secure as it can be, right, without the possibility of it getting hacked. Now, I can't guarantee that. I don't think anybody can. Whoever says that they can guarantee a server not getting hacked is lying, right? I'll say it here first, right? And I don't even need to be certified to say that. I can say that just because it's true. Just have a look at the NPM packages that we've been talking about on this particular LinkedIn channel earlier, and you'll get the picture as to what I'm talking about, right? NPM package, which is called the supply chain attack from the upstream, right? And this rolls into things like Lovable. It rolls into things like Vercel, right? Where you see a lot of these particular packages being contributed to, but at the same time, there's so many PRs coming in around vulnerabilities from AI-based attacks that is virtually impossible to keep up with. So there's a lot of thinking there which needs to be put into the architecture in order for it to make sense. Yeah, and this is the thing that I want to get people to understand is that when we do a lot of DevOps, it's great to have a project, it's fantastic, but think about the trade-offs. Think about, right, what it is that you're trying to achieve in terms of the project to make it make sense. And this is one of the times where this makes sense, and this is why I'm showing you this particular diagram. Yeah. So moving on, right? What did I do about it? Well, we've got a number of different resources available, right? In terms of the trade-off, right? Nowadays we have things like AI, right? And now I see a lot of people on different platforms talk about AI, and they talk about all these MD and Markdown things, and they talk about all of this and all of that, buy my course this and buy my course that, and it's always the same problem, right? To me, it's always the same problem, yeah? It's the same generic information, it's the same sort of stuff, just saying, right, this is what you can do with it, and nobody turned around and said, I've made an enterprise architecture. Well, let me be the first person to say I've actually built an enterprise architecture with it from scratch. And if you don't believe me, right, I'm going to show you some proof. This is the proof. Yeah, and we'll get onto that in a minute. So what architecture did I use as an enterprise level architecture for this small business? Right? What was the value that was brought? So this was what I basically had in my head. I said, right, couple of iterations here. We've gone from an EC2 instance down to a VPS. Now, the one that you saw just now was a VPS. Now, why did I use VPS? Because of the reasons that I talked about with AWS and Azure. But on top of that, right, there are different costs which are involved. So, for example, a lot of you may know about the egress and the ingress costs when moving data around, right? It doesn't matter if it's the CNI, right, which you're looking at, which is your container network interface, or even if you're just transferring data from one AZ to another, there's an incurred cost in doing so. Now, of course, you could have things like VPC peering. You could have, what else was there? Was something called I think it's called a private, you could have a private VPC, all of that sort of stuff. I think it's called private peering, private endpoints, that was it, private endpoints. So you can have a private endpoint and basically say, yeah, you know, I can move all the traffic inside on the internal network, but there's still a cost involved in all of that, right? You still have to have a cost, right? Even when you're using those particular storage disks, right? I think it's called block storage in EC2 that you can apply directly on the EC2 instance, right? There's a cost involved in all of that. So you have to take that all into account and say, well, what's the best option here, right? Now, yes, I could have used EKS. Yes, I could have used AKS. Yes, I could have used all these different architectures. But let's think about this for a second. Does it make sense for me to use something like ECS on this particular project, knowing that I can have ingress and egress costs, right? When I can use for the same set amount of cost, right, a VPS system and have virtually unlimited bandwidth, right, on the 1 gigabit per second stream, right? That's another thing, right? How much bandwidth do we have available when using these particular neoclouds or cloud providers? Because not a lot, you don't get a lot for your money. A lot of people think you get a lot for your money in terms of the CapEx, right? Because you lower the expenditure in terms of the servers, the trainings, right? That you need to have it all in there. But let's think about it for a second. Do you really save anything? Because it's all dependent on your context here. And the context is the biggest thing that I see so little of on LinkedIn. Context. There's more AI generated slop nowadays. Yeah, I get it, but at the end of the day, it's the context which matters in terms of what we provide to the business, right? The context matters. Communication, right? So I sat down and I talked and I basically said, right, look, you know, I can create the automated system, right? And what we can do is that we can use things like AI in order to help us with this. And we can think about the architecture, right? I've got enough experience under my belt to say, you know, what's the particular architecture that I'm looking for? Well, I know about CI/CD. Why don't we implement CI/CD? Right? I know about infrastructure as code. Why don't we implement infrastructure as code? I know a little bit about monitoring. Okay, do I need to know everything about monitoring? Probably not. We can just say, right, okay, what are the bits that I do know about monitoring? What are the bits that I don't know about monitoring? We can fill in the rest with AI as long as it matches the end-to-end requirements that we require, right? Because the end-to-end requirements are basically the unit tests and the end-to-end testing that we need. That goes back into the architecture, right? And that's the value that I can say, right, you know, here's the end-to-end architecture, here's the unit test. Does it pass, does it fail? If it doesn't, right, we need to do something about it, right? That could be something as simple as saying, you know, we need to understand what's the mean average of the loading times in the website and get that as a statistic and say, right, okay, well, what's causing that particular problem? And it could be just over provisioning of caching, which causes the website to slow down because it has to go back to the object cache and retrieve that information from a very large pool of memory. And that can cause issues, yeah? So it's stuff like that we've got to be thinking about. We've got to be understanding, right, okay, you know, what sort of trade-offs, what's the optimum that we can get this to? And it takes time. This is not something that you can do in 3 or 4 weeks with some developers and say, yeah, that's what it is, right? Especially not as a solo. If you have 5 or 6, yeah, maybe. But as a solo person, absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's a different level, different kettle of fish there. So moving on with that, this is what I said, right? I said GitHub Actions, right? Why GitHub Actions? CI/CD. Docker. So my initial plan was Docker out of Docker runners. It wasn't Docker in Docker runners. Why did I say Docker out of Docker runners? Because it was a little bit more secure in terms of its deployment. And on top of that, right, what allowed me to do was it allowed me to run the same commands, like, you know, the Docker run stuff, the Docker compose up stuff, and basically say, right, okay, it's running outside of Docker using the same host network. Now I noticed a problem with this. I noticed another problem with this. Because I thought the value of this was like, okay, yeah, I'm going to put it all there, put it all up. I have all these runners. They now, you know, work and scale because there's a custom Python script which scales them up and down. You know, everything's nice, right? Everything's good. Turns out that was a bit of a mistake, because what I learned during that process was that actually, although I have Docker outside of Docker, one of the things that's problematic is that, well, it uses the same socket if I'm utilizing more than one runner, right? If I'm using port 80 for an Nginx project and I've got another one which is running on port 80, right, just to do some basic unit testing, right, or basically to do some, up and down infrastructure, the problem then becomes, well, I'm utilizing the same port on the same network, and I can cause context deadlines and I can cause conflicts. And as a result of that conflict, my runners start to cancel, they start doing weird things with the entire environment as a result, and therefore, right, the project fails on the pipeline run, which is never a good thing, right? It's never a good thing. I said, that's a problem. That's a problem. So what did I do to get around this particular problem? Well, I just said, right, okay, if that is such a problem whereby I'm having this Docker problem, what I can do is use Docker in Docker. Now, Docker in Docker uses something called Sysbox, it uses containerd, and it uses Docker, as far as I remember. Now, using Sysbox and then using Docker inside of the actual runner basically means it isolates out the environment to say whatever Docker load you work with, right, works inside as an isolated environment. Therefore, it doesn't need to worry about utilizing the IP tables which are inside of the actual host system or even the ports. It's just isolated to that particular runner, which is great for what I'm doing, which is Docker-based testing, right? It's all a Docker project, so therefore I need to have Docker-based testing. And as a result, right, what that means is I can now isolate the particular project, which is the custom WordPress container, and say, right, this is what is happening, and the result is better deployments, right? Showing value all the way. So we build it, we test that particular Docker container, and we say, yes, is this what we want? Yes, okay, cool. Now, why did I use a custom one as opposed to something like Bitnami or even using the original WordPress container? The reason for this was very simple for me. I didn't want to be using Apache when I already was using an Nginx workflow. It just didn't make sense to me. Yeah? It didn't make sense to me. Because at the end of the day, Nginx, as far as I understand it, can utilize higher levels of requests as opposed to Apache, which means that when more people come and, which was one of our particular objectives, which was high traffic volumes. We can support higher traffic volumes as a result of using that particular architecture as opposed to using the original Apache one. Now, there's nothing wrong with the Apache one. It's pretty good. You can use the LAMP and Nginx stack, right? The LAMP or the LAMP stack, right? Because that's what you normally do, is that inside of the Nginx container inside of the Apache container, let me get this right. Inside of the WordPress container, you use Apache, right? Now, Apache by default has something called the mod rewrite, and you have the Apache H file at the top, right? The problem with that is that it becomes very limited in terms of your deployment options, because by default, the only option that you have available to you through that Docker container is Apache. Now, I prefer Nginx because you can write the nginx.conf file and basically say, right, okay, what do I want to do? Okay, I want to have that extra features on my Nginx container to say that, to make it go faster, actually, right? And I actually did that using multi-stage builds. And because I use multi-stage builds, I can then say, right, okay, this is what my particular Nginx container entails. And as a result, right, I get faster performance, right? On top of that, I can even say something like, well, I want certain PHP packages installed in my Nginx container as opposed to having it separated out, which is what you would normally do, right? Which means that I have a bigger container, yes, but at the same time, right, it's built for a purpose. And that custom flexibility also allows me to do things like OpenTelemetry. And that's going back to our initial diagnosis, right? Which was like we didn't have any monitoring, remember? That was one of the things which was a problem. Now, why did I use OpenTelemetry? Because OpenTelemetry allows me to do things like distributed tracing. Now, when you have distributed tracing, what does that mean? When you have distributed tracing? When you have distributed tracing, what it means is that you can look at the actual stack trace of the container and basically say, right, okay, what's happening inside of my container, right? What's going on? Where are the calls going to? And having that bit of telemetry basically tells me, okay, I know exactly what's going on inside of my container. I know what's taking what amount of time. And as a result, right, I can see if I need to make any optimizations based upon the actual intelligence that's coming back from that container. Now, I don't really mean intelligence in the sense of, woo-woo, sort of magic stuff. What I'm saying is, right, anything that comes out of that container, I can see and I can monitor and I can make a judgment as to whether or not it's optimized for the requirements and therefore giving the value to the client, right? Because I can then say with absolute certainty, look, this is what's going on. I'm not guessing, right? I'm not guessing like I was before, maintaining this particular project. It's now a case of I can see what's going on. I have an idea. I can sift through the data. The data makes sense to me, and this is what is going on. And I can see if there's any sort of problems or not, right? What needs to be done? Oh, maybe my P10 is a little bit high. My P5, right? My percentiles in terms of the information for TTBF, right? For example, so the time between mean failures was the buffer time essentially with the site, right? Perhaps it's too high. Perhaps it's 10 seconds. It needs to be 1. Okay, well I can see what's going on and basically say, right, okay, what is the thing which is happening? And that's one of the reasons why I wrote that. And as we talked about, you see Nginx containers, right, our metrics going into OpenTelemetry and Prometheus, right? Prometheus being the TSDB, which is called the time series database. And with that, what am I saying with this? Well, basically what I'm saying is I want to be able to collect all the metrics, put that into somewhere which makes sense, and I can say to the procurement manager, I can say to the client, look, this is what's happening inside of my container via Grafana dashboard. So Grafana's not on here, but it should be via the Grafana dashboard, right, which is all written in JSON anyway, and basically just say, right, this is what is happening, right, based upon the data sources that we have. Now, having more data sources is a good thing, but the problem is it can become overwhelming as engineers, because what that means is when we have more data coming in, it becomes very difficult to sift out what the noise is as opposed to what's relevant. So how do you solve that problem? How do you turn around and say what is noise and what is relevant? The way that I did it was I said, right, what do I care about and what do I not care about? So I care about things like CPU usage. I care about, how many people are hitting the site. I care about the loading times. I care about what is happening down at the cache level. What is happening down, right, with the actual container itself, right? Is it getting stuck? Is it, what the logs out from that container? I care about that, right? Now, if I get all that information out of the SRE stack, right, now I'm saying, okay, this is all good information for me, and I can negate the noise because I'm not interested in all the other stuff, right? I don't need to know, for example, what Cloudflare is doing necessarily, as long as there's traffic coming into Cloudflare and that, it's up. Because that's all I care about, right? As an SRE platform, DevOps, whatever you want to call it, that's the only thing that I care about, right? Take a sip of water. So what else do we care about, right? What other value can we show? Well, we have a MySQL database here. So why did I put MySQL inside of the Docker Compose file? Because it seems like a bit of an anti-pattern, doesn't it? It seems like, well, that was a bit silly, wasn't it? Like, why would you put that there, right? Doesn't make any sense, because at the end of the day, right, what's a normal architecture pattern? Well, you would have a read replica going into something like an Elasticache, right, if you're using AWS. And then you would say, right, okay, well, I've got caching going into my my database, which is great, and then I would use something like a read replica to go and do my development, right? Because it makes sense. Right? But here's the problem: that incurs cost, right? That incurs cost. That's the crux of it, is that it incurs cost, and it's a lot more expensive for me to do that. Now, would I do that in real life? Absolutely. I would do an RDS-based backup. So now people are thinking, well, okay, well, how did you get around that problem? How did you get around that problem knowing that you have a potential bottleneck and a potential failure within the system? Well, here's the thing. I can architect around it, right? So what did I say? Well, I can say, right, because I own the actual infrastructure, right, because it's running on a VPS, I can actually go in and basically make the backup. I can make that as a timely backup based on a GitHub Actions pipeline. And now by doing so, I can put that in something like an S3 bucket and basically say, okay, well, these are all the backups. I'll make it private. I'll have the minimum requirements that I need to access it, but keep it close to the outside world. Now, of course, that's not always 100% correct to do, and I admit that, right? It's not necessarily industry best practice, right? Normally you'd have the RDS and you'd have that all, taken care of. But in our case, that doesn't work because the cost factor is something which is absolutely horrendous. Yeah. Now you could make this statement and say, well, why didn't you go over to the procurement manager? Why didn't you go over to the manager and say, this is a problem? Now, when you're running with a small business, cost is everything, right? Cost is something which will get in the way of many, many projects. Because what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that they want to protect their revenue and the profits, right? They want to protect it, right? So what's the value in doing it this way? Well, it's a bit of a compromise, right? That was the trade-off. The trade-off is it's a compromise. We're not saying it's the best solution out there like since sliced bread. We're not saying, it's the be-all and end-all, bee's knees, here we go type thing. Yes, it's a bit of a greenfields project, but it's not the end-all and be-all. What we're saying is, right, this is a bit problematic. This is a potential solution which, satisfies both parties because we're backing up the data. It's in an S3 bucket. Okay, cool. And it's automated. So we hit two of that three criteria, right? We hit the criteria by basically being lazy. I don't know how else to word it. We hit that criteria. And that's the value that we provide. We basically say, right, okay, look, it is a problem, but here's a potential solution, right? And by doing it that way, we're saying, yes, there's a potential of catastrophic failure, but we can bring that information back, right? Because I've had it personally happen to me over the past couple of years, right? I went inside of this particular WordPress environment, and I wanted to back up the database. Now, in doing so, ironically, what happened was that I ended up deleting some files, which I shouldn't have been doing, right? Which was a bit ironic when you think about it, right? You're going in there, you're backing up the database, but then you delete the data. Yes, it can happen, right? It can happen due to, insufficient guardrails. So what did I do to fix it? I said, well, okay, let's go find the latest backup. Let's see if we can repair this. And, we did in the end, which is great. But at the end of the day, right, I decided at that point there, and I said, right, look, I'm going to make some proper guardrails. I'm going to have S3 going, S3 as our backup, and I'm going to make an automated backup system, which is every week. How did I keep the cost low then? Well, the way that I keep the cost low was very, very simple. What I said was, we'll keep what's called, so there's versioning basically within S3. You can have like this versioning thing. And because you have S3 versioning enabled, right, I can go back and I can go forward to the latest and, the non-latest version of the backup. Because the backups are done every week. Because the backups are done every week, I have 52 backups within the year. Any delta that is within those backups are captured every week. And that's the way you do it, right? You say, right, okay, this is what's going on. This is what the potential solution is. And that's how we provide value, people. That's how we do it, yeah? And that's basically it. So that's what I demonstrated over the past year, right? To demonstrate that we have read and writes within our database. Also, because I was interested in that, but it was a bit of a non-issue because the metrics which I got back were about, 0.15 milliseconds, that sort of thing, which is very, very good for a database because it's all on the same network. So that wasn't really a problem, right? The main problem was just getting the metrics out of the container. And that's why I chose to do a custom container to begin with, because it gave us that flexibility. Because when you look at things like Bitnami, the normal WordPress containers, yeah, you can get a few, Nginx hardened containers. I know Bitnami does one, which is great. I mean, there's no shade to Bitnami. It's a great container, great company. But at the end of the day, right, I need a bit more. I need a bit more data. I need to know what's happening in that stack. Now, yes, you can turn around and say, well, joke's on you. You could have used Lovable. You could have used, you could have used what's that other one? Shopify. You could have used Magento. You could have used, all these other players, and you probably would have got a bit better because it would have been like £3, £5, and all that sort of stuff. But let me give you a bit of history. Let me give you a bit of history with this particular project. With this particular project, when I talked to the owner of the site, one of the things that came apparent was that we were getting, it's not even me, it was they were getting pushed over. Yeah, they're spending £600 on support for the particular software, which was e-commerce. They were getting screwed over by the SEO changes with SSL because SSL was becoming a thing. Padlocks were coming into play, and they had nowhere else to go besides making the actual server themselves because control was everything. They just needed a lot of control. And when I say we, I mean both of us basically. You know, and that was the flexibility we weren't getting with our particular providers. So we had to build vertically. We had to build vertically. And that in the long term actually has served better than going through these particular channels whereby you pay extra for things like plugins, you pay extra for the hosting, you pay extra, right, for the support, right? And what we found was that the particular old project that we had was Perl. It was all Perl stack. It was very, very disheartening to see the Perl stack there. Yeah? The Perl stack was not great. Was not great. In fact, maybe I should leave with that. But basically, the Perl stack wasn't great. It was becoming obsolete. We weren't able to get many people to go and host it. I tried to host the original package, couldn't do it. Both parties just said no. You know, one was giving me an SSL certificate, other one was giving me a hosting package. Bad support all round. Company restructure, company reshuffle, you know, and just couldn't get stuff done. It was just a nightmare. So I turned around and said, well, I'm learning WordPress at the time. You know, I'm learning all these different things. Sat down, I had a little bit of a think, you know, should we go with Magento? Should we go with WordPress? I said WordPress. Why did I go for WordPress? Because in my mind, it was easier to use than Magento. And it was a nice compromise between design and performance that we required. So we said, well, let's go with it. Now, WordPress by itself is a blogging system. It doesn't necessarily provide value in terms of e-commerce, but it kind of gets around that with something called WooCommerce. Now, WooCommerce allows you to do all these sort of different things and allows you to go through section by section, which is pretty awesome. So yeah. What's the time now? 30 minutes. Okay. So yeah, that's what allowed us to do. It was really, really good that way. Right, I am going to